in the industry session this afternoon, and you heard it from different kind of angles. You heard about growth via innovation, and we heard about growth via acquisition and combinations of those things. I was astounded that National Instruments has one new product a day. That took me back. But we heard a variety of different interesting ideas, I think, this afternoon, and I think we'll take and run with those in our faculty panel here, wherein what we'll look at, in addition to saying, what's the inside story behind some of these successfully growing companies, what maybe are some of the barriers to doing that? What are some of the barriers to growth, whether we're talking about this from an acquisition standpoint or from a globalization standpoint or from an organic growth kind of standpoint? And to that end, I've invited three of my colleagues from the McCombs faculty to join this afternoon, and what we'll do is we'll give them a relatively brief opportunity to talk about growth and some strategies for overcoming barriers to growth. And then we'll have much more opportunity in this session for questions and answers and maybe a little bit of debate back and forth. Okay? The three colleagues that I've invited today, John Doggett is a senior lecturer in the Department of Management. He is focused on international entrepreneurship and is a senior research fellow at UT's IC Squared Institute. And he's the co-founder of UT's International Idea to Product Competition. You're catching a theme there, I'm guessing. Since 2000, Professor Doggett has spent each summer and winter teaching entrepreneurship and global competition workshops in places like Austria, China, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, Mexico, Singapore, Thailand. Lots of international things happening there. My guess is that you may talk a little bit about international kind of components and driving growth in that kind of context.
Yeah, I was going to talk about Oklahoma.
Good, okay. That's a cultural shift. And then to his left, we have Raji Srinivasan. Raji's an associate professor of marketing here at the McCombs School. She received a master's in physics, and later on an MBA from the Indian Institute of Management, her PhD from Penn State. Her research focuses on marketing strategy, organizational innovation, marketing metrics, and looks a lot at how we can actually succeed in turbulent environments. And finally, to her left, we have Jim Nolan. And Jim is a distinguished senior lecturer in the Department of Finance here at the McCombs School. He came here in 1980, teaches graduate classes in corporate finance and entrepreneurship, research interests in business valuation, mergers and acquisitions, private equity, and venture capital. He's the faculty advisor for our Venture Fellows program and the Entrepreneurship Society. And he is also president of CFO Services, which is a middle market consulting firm specializing in business valuations and M&A advisory services. So that's our threesome for this evening. And John, why don't we start with you? You want to start with Jim first?
Absolutely.
All right. So he defers to Jim. Tell us about your perspectives on growth.
Well, I sat through the industry panel, and we saw a couple of firms. Both John Barra, who was the chairman of Emerson, said that not only did they get global growth, which John's going to address, but they also did strategic acquisitions. That they had invested $600 million, also divested some investments that didn't fit, but obviously they have a roadmap of where they want to go, and they're filling that roadmap with strategic acquisitions. We also saw BBVA has really come into the United States, and in fact, globally has done it through acquisitions. They've acquired banks in Mexico, the United States, around the globe as a growth strategy through acquisition. So really that's what I wanted to talk to, not so much from big companies. Now I know we've got a mix of audience here, but if I was sitting with a big company, a strategic investor right now, sitting on a ton of cash, I'm earning what, 1%, okay? Maybe if I'm lucky on my cash, then one growth option would be, so obviously I could invest and get a bigger global footprint, or I could invest in R&D and new product. But another one would be to go out and buy market share, go out and buy companies. And here's the reason why I think it's a good opportunity right now. The competition is very low. Private equity's out of the market right now. The credit freeze pretty much got rid of all the leverage buyout opportunities, so the private equity firms are on the sidelines. Venture firms basically are at the end of their runway. They now have firms that started and invested in '01, '02, '03 are coming up. Most venture capital firms are 10-year limited partnership. There's no exits. There were 8 venture-backed IPOs last year. There have been a couple this SolarWinds here in Austin, a few that went public, but they've got constipation. I mean, they've made all these investments and there's no exits on the other side. And so at some point, their limited partners are going to say, I want my money back. So that right now, you're seeing secondary markets developed, and a lot of times it is other private equity firms that are raising funds to participate, and they're buying these opportunities at deep discounts because private equity and venture capital are not liquid investments. They have all kinds of restrictions. They're long-term plays. And so I think it's an opportunity for a lot of strategic investors that have cash. Now, financing's difficult right now. Getting debt, okay, trying to leverage the deal is hard, but if you've got cash, if you can go in, make strategic acquisitions at low valuations right now, I think it's a way to get market share growth. But the key to M&A is always integration, and BBVA has done a pretty good job of being able to take Compass and now Guarantee and some pretty big organizations and then try and assimilate them into the BBVA culture. In banking, that's very difficult, especially when you have cultures that are more siloed. They don't do cross-selling things that Tiffany talked about. But for small or large companies, the opportunities right now because of low valuations make it a great opportunity for M&A as a growth strategy.
Thank you. All right. You want to pick up with that?
Good evening. I wanted to sort of look at, or Galen's basically asked me to look at organic growth as a mechanism for a way to grow in these times. And I actually want to set the stage a little bit and think about the recession itself. And I understand that I was not able to make the earlier session. I just came in from Boston. But in the earlier session, there was a talk of what happens in recessions. What essentially happens in recessions, and we've seen this before and it happens time and time again, is that consumers are frozen. And consumers are frozen because they don't have the purchasing power. And the good question then is, what should firms do? And I come from this with a marketing perspective. What should firms do with respect to sort of investing for organic growth, right? So one option to do is just to sort of pull back. So just wait for this to sort of subside and then come in. But my own research, and if you look at the evidence around, suggests that it may not be a great strategy for all firms. Why is that? There are tectonic shifts during recessions when market shares of firms shift a lot. Companies that are in the top 10% in market share move down to the bottom, and those that are at the bottom move up. So really one way to sort of think about this for organic growth is that recession is a time of opportunity. Now this might seem strange and maybe a little Pollyannish, coming, and saying, okay, now is this really true? But I want to sort of provide you some evidence as to why this might be the case. Let's look at what happens in recessions. Recessions are a time when everything is called to question. So it really is a time when you can take strategic decisions. So in terms of organic growth, what comes to mind? Think about brands. How do we grow brands? New products, channels, and markets. And I would sort of say that this might really be a time to sort of reassess everything. Decisions which may not have been possible during normal times get questioned, and you can actually take bold decisions. What else happens? There is supply side efficiencies. Costs go down. Just as there are targets of opportunity for acquisition, I would argue that there are targets of opportunity for people, targets of opportunity for R&D, advertising, and this really is a time to sort of think about investing. Is this true, therefore, for all firms? Clearly not, right? Because recessions are also times when firms fail, and a large number of them fail. So it's not really the prescription for all firms, but if you are looking like you are positioned to sort of survive the recession, this may really be a time to invest, because remember, and this is something that seems not possible at this time, but typically every time there is a recession, there is a recovery. That's the good news. It takes time. And it may be a time to invest in brands, channels, and markets. The fourth point that I really want to sort of stress is that it's also a time to question operations in terms of promotions, in terms of product packaging, in terms of pricing, to really sort of capitalize. So I would like to sort of say that This is a time for organic growth because there are targets of opportunity on your supply side. There are targets of opportunity awaiting you when the recession finishes, and you sort of have to position yourself in various dimensions to capitalize on this opportunity.
Fantastic. John?
You know, building on this, I've told my students for years that at times when the market's in chaos is the greatest opportunity for you to change your position from a market share or a market position standpoint, because the incumbents are trying everything they can to hold on to what they have, and they're somewhat distracted. And if the chaos is huge, the incumbents are now suffering. Well, there are a couple things that are going on to build on what my colleagues are saying. We in this country right now are undergoing navel-gazing exercise of amazing proportion. We're preoccupied with the Recovery Act, we're preoccupied with health care, and what we're not noticing is that there is a amazing tsunami, tectonic, earthquake, strategic inflection point shift going on right now. Goldman Sachs predicted in 2001 that Brazil, Russia, India, and China would be dominant economic powers, and people thought they were crazy. Last year, 25% of all the world's economic growth came from those 4 countries. And in the next 5 to 7 years, the economy of both India and China will double. Now, the implications of that are significant on a number of levels, and it's significant from a growth standpoint. There are a number of things that are going on. One is we're starting to see domestic companies in China and India emerge to become global competitors. And I can guarantee you this is the tip of the iceberg. And it's showing up in big and small ways. And we all have heard of the fact that Tata, one of the largest family businesses in India, bought Jaguar and Range Rover from Ford for cash. But what a lot of people don't know is that Chinese investors also bought 20% of the Cleveland Cavaliers for cash. So LeBron now has to learn how to speak a little Chinese to deal with 1/5 of his ownership. What we're seeing, though, is something that we've seen in the past. So this is where combining practical experience and research is really important. If you remember the old days of the 1980s when everybody was worried about Japan Inc., the Japanese are coming in, they're buying everything. And we had the Secretary of Treasury and Secretary of Commerce going back and forth to Japan saying, you're not playing fair with us, the balance of payments deficit is getting bigger and bigger. Well, the same thing is now happening with China. Well, here's the news. It's going to happen with China, it's going to happen with India, it's going to happen with Brazil, it's going to happen with a number of other countries, because we are moving into a time where more and more economic activity is going to be outside of the United States. One of the next big countries from an economic standpoint is going to be Vietnam. They're following the path of China, realizing that they can have slightly open society that's more market-based. And so what we're seeing now is that a lot of the environmentally questionable businesses that were in China are now moving to Vietnam. And that process is going to continue. So what does that mean for you? Whether you're small, medium, or large. You're going to face more competition from countries that you never thought about as competitors. And you're going to face some opportunities that you probably hadn't thought about. I just had lunch today with one of my former students who's from Mexico, and we were bemoaning how many Mexican professionals are now leaving Mexico because of the violence, the narco violence there. And he's getting ready to go back, and my advice to him was to make sure that he had clean underwear and a shirt so that he can leave real fast, because I quite frankly think Mexico is going to go in the wrong direction for a little while before it finally turns itself around, and eventually will turn around. So there are going to be opportunities for you to hire people who are looking for a way out, but who have great contacts, great experience, and great capability and networks in a lot of different countries. 1. 2, if you are making products or services that have a market outside of Austin, Texas, you need to start thinking about what type of competition is going to emerge from either the Pacific or from the Atlantic. Because what we are seeing are fundamental shifts in the definition of competition. Many of us are familiar with Skype. In fact, the founders of Skype are now suing eBay, which paid them, I think, $1.6 billion, but they're still suing them for violating their copyright. But what most of us don't know is that the founders of Skype are from Estonia, a country of 1 million people. Estonia. So what we're seeing now, what I'm seeing, because I do a lot of work that's international in scope, as Galen said, is we in this country are so consumed with what's going on, and there are a lot of problems with all the unemployment and all the economic challenges, that we don't realize that if you remember back to the tsunami that struck Thailand and other parts of Southeast Asia, there's an economic tsunami that is sweeping toward us. And like the water tsunami, it's not going to stop. And so we have a very simple choice. We become aware of it, we start planning for it, we start managing for it, or when it hits, we can bend over and hope that somebody will take a picture of us before we disappear under the waves. It's happening. And what I find in the work that I do and the time I spend with companies is that it takes a while for people to accept the fact that Goldman's predictions, even if they're off by 50%, mean that in the next 15 to 20 years, China will be the largest economy in the world. The next 30 to 40 years, India will be neck and neck with the United States as to which will be the second largest economy in the world. Now, why is that important? India and China have 40% of all the people on this planet. And what we know from Japan is that when you have a vibrant domestic market, what does that do? It gives companies that serve that domestic market an ability to grow and get stronger and learn how to compete, and then to have a base that they can use to go outside. And we're seeing that in automobiles right now, where Toyota now is the largest automobile manufacturer in the world, coming from Japan, which has a population now of about 140 million. What happens when the Toyota of China or the Toyota of India says it's time for us to go global? And the answer is obvious. They're going to be coming from markets, domestic markets of over 1 billion people. In fact, we've already seen that with Tata. Most of you, some of you may have seen the smart car that Mercedes bought. And when I see people driving down I-35 in a smart car, I say my prayers for them because they're really small. Well, the smart car costs, what, about $25,000, $30,000, fully loaded. Tata, the people who brought Jaguar and Range Rover, they have their version of the smart car. It's called the Nano. And their top-of-the-line luxury version Nano costs $3,800. 38 versus about 25,000. And what Tata is doing is they're not trying to sell to people who want to drive it down Mopac. They're selling it to the 90% of the world that's not Western Europe and not the United States. And so my last comment before we get to the Q&A session is this. When I look at what China and India are doing in some other countries, they're making a very interesting bet. They're saying at some point these navel gazers are going to get upset with us, and they're going to try to do to us what they did to Japan. And we want to make sure that when that happens, it's irrelevant. And so they're practicing something that economists call decoupling. And what? Decoupling, yes. And that's a nice ringtone. And what that means is that they're making massive investments in other parts of the world. One of my students today said, well, you know, China is so dependent on the United States. And I said, yeah, they are, for 20% of their exports. The other 80% goes to other parts of the world. And the two parts of the world that it goes to in big numbers is Africa and Latin America. A friend of mine who works for a very large company said he saw evidence that Chinese and Indian firms have signed contracts that will give them control over half of the world's natural resources by 2012. And that sounds really dramatic until you think, well, if you had Africa and Latin America together, that's half the world's natural resources. We in this country don't think that way. And so what happens if you have a Toyota type of experience coming out of China and India where their primary markets aren't the US and Western Europe, but their primary markets are Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. And this market, the US, is an afterthought.
All right.
John, here's a $50 trillion note from the Bank of Zimbabwe. I'll buy one.
I always wanted to have that. I want it.
You want the $50 trillion note? Okay.
How the
It
hell?
really is a $50 trillion.
That's right. And how much is it really worth?
12 cents in US dollars. But
So I guess since I'm sitting at the table, I'll ask the first question, and then we'll open it up, and I'll let you ask some questions. I guess there's the people who look for the bottom, right, and try and time things out and say, all right, well, I'm waiting until I think that we really truly are now coming out of this thing. Is it time to play offense? Should we wait? It sounds like each of you are relatively optimistic and say now's the time to take advantage of opportunities. Is the timing right now?
Well, on the M&A front, obviously the problem is it takes the convergence of three markets. You got to have willing buyers, willing sellers in the capital markets. That's at a disequilibrium right now. Capital markets aren't there. And you even have problems with sellers who are reluctant, saying, if I think the economy's bottom and is going to start increasing, maybe now's not the time to sell. So until the capital markets come back to bridge, but then it's going to be late because you're going to be back in competing, valuations will go up, so the returns might not be there. But I think it needs to go beyond just domestic acquisitions. It could be strategic, going after technology and things like that. So I'm outsourcing my R&D and acquiring from VC portfolios that have run their course of the 10 years of going in and acquiring those in the secondary market very cheaply. Or it could be going global by making acquisitions to be able to participate in the economic progress of these other companies, which is what large companies like Ford and GM have done by making investments in plays over there. But.
Can I speak to that?
Please.
Really good question, which is there time for me to wait? Or should we just? It's not clear to me that actually American companies have time to wait, and I think this really. I want to pick up on what John spoke about. There is a worldwide recession. It's not clear, and I do not want to be, to sort of predict what's going to happen. I don't think really anybody really knows what's going to happen. The question is, do we have time to pull back and wait? I think the answer to that is perhaps no. And the reason I say this is, I think there are other countries and companies in other countries waiting, snapping at the heels of American companies. And the longer you wait out this, I think you have to cycle very hard to sort of play them. And I think the population demographics for America are not favorable in the following sense. 250 million people, 300 million people, 350 million, we're still talking small numbers. In India and China, I assume the same thing, the numbers are very, very different. The middle class in India, depending on how you define middle class, is anywhere between 400 to 600 million and growing. The age group between 18 and 32 in India is growing. It's called the population inflection. These are markets that are waiting to be captured. If American companies don't come up with products and services and technologies and innovations and brands at this time, nobody's going to wait. And if you miss that market to enter that at the right time, I think you lose a big opportunity. 350 million, 600 million. I know we feel like there is another trend, which is that we want to consume less. We realize that there's only so much that you can consume. But I think Chinese consumers and Indian consumers are saying, great, you've consumed, you've messed up, now you want us to go really simple. That's not going to happen. So they are ready for products, and I think it's not clear that we can sort of wait for the US economy or the Western European economy to pick up before we sort of move. So I think I don't know if the recession is going to lift next week. Bernanke, I think yesterday said the worst is over. I think we've all been really bad at predicting this, and so that's probably not. The question is, given we want to be in business in the long term, and if the global arena, the numbers in terms of market, 6 billion people, 2 billion of these or 3 billion of these with some purchase power outside, are we going to wait or let somebody else come in? And I think he made a really good point about Africa. I've heard about how China is really controlling the natural resources in Africa the way the European countries used to control mines and resources in Africa. They're really getting a first mover advantage in countries. So
here's the big difference, though, about what they're doing in Africa, which I think is intriguing. They're going after natural resource deals, and they're doing military assistance deals like we've done all the time. But they're doing one other thing. They're saying, we don't just want your natural resources. We want to develop you as markets for our products. So we want to invest in infrastructure. So we're going to help you build your roads or rebuild your roads, dams, your electric grids, ports, airports. We want to invest in education because for decoupling to work, your economies have to become more advanced so that you can buy more and more of what we produce. Because if we try to sell everything that we can make as our economies grow just to the United States and Europe, at some point, everybody in the United States and Europe is going to say, I have enough. But if you think about it, the traditional world economy, the advanced economy, assumed that 5/6 of the world's population was going to be lesser developed countries and poor forever. And the Chinese are saying, no, we're going to change that definition. So what does that mean? Again, going back to Goldman Sachs, they say in the next 10 years, the middle class, as they define it, in India and China is going to go from 250 million people to 1 billion people. And they said that 2 years ago. And so if they're right, that means in the next 10 years, 750 million new members of the middle class are going to emerge for the first time, wanting products and services. So getting back to Galen's question, has the recession in it? Are we at the bottom? I don't think so. I mean, Jim's the expert in finance, but if you look at all the derivatives that are out there that nobody knows about, if you look at commercial real estate that's not marked to market, if you look at all the stuff that's going on in this little thing called the ballooning deficit that the CBO says is going to double in the next 10 years, I think that only a mad person would say we are definitely at the bottom. But what I am seeing is people becoming more comfortable with this new reality of things aren't working as well as we'd like them to work, and realizing that we got to make some decisions. And those who are getting comfortable with this new reality, not waiting for the bottom, are starting to pull the trigger. And as they start to pull the trigger, some other people are saying, well, good grief, these deals are working, maybe I should do it. So I agree with Jim. If you wait too long, even though we may not be at the bottom, you're going to find that the prices are starting to go up. And if you've been looking for houses in Austin, you're seeing evidence the prices are starting to go up.
Well, John, John, the African people already know technology and apparently have a lot of money, because I get emails daily telling me they'll send me $25 million.
Well, you know what's really interesting? We all get these emails, although I have a pretty good spam blocker for that, but the FBI says that Americans and Europeans lose about $800 million a year to those scams.
All right, so I want to open it up to audience questions. What I'll do is if you can call out your question, I'll repeat the question so that people can hear it who are watching this in video later, and then we'll give the panel a chance to respond. Sure.
I can't wait for you to repeat that question.
Yes, so let me know if I don't capture this correctly, but if we look at these emerging markets or at these perhaps less developed economies where there is, less infrastructure, less democracy, justice, corruption issues emerging, environmental concerns, does it pale in comparison to what we have, and does that matter then as you look to invest? Is that fair? Okay.
The answer is your observations are very accurate, but they're accurate in terms of looking at what was happening in the past, not what's happening in the future. If you want to understand what China's model is Singapore. Singapore on the surface is democracy. If you've spent any time in Singapore, you know it's a benign dictatorship. And if you learn from looking at Singapore, what you see is a country that was almost bankrupt in 1965 that became one of the Asian tigers. I spent a lot of time going in and out of China. My wife is from China, and I can tell you it's amazing. If you spend time going back and forth to China, the changes that occur in a very short period of time, sometimes 4, 5, 6 months, you go to a city and you get lost because they've done so much. So I wouldn't be confident that the problems that the Chinese have are problems they can't overcome at a fairly rapid pace. And democracy, which is something that I support fervently, is, as my Indian friends would say, a two-edged sword. The good thing about democracy is that everybody has a vote. The bad thing about democracy is that everybody has a vote. And when a country has to make hard decisions that will restructure its economy, a democracy, as we here in the United States know, is not necessarily the best political decision to make hard, long-range decisions that require massive capital investments over 5, 10, 15 years. The Chinese government can do it. and they do it. So Africa, I spent a lot of time in Africa, a bunch of failed states. You know what makes Africa special? The biggest treasure trove of natural resources yet to be tapped in the world. The Chinese and the Indians understand that, and they're making investments. There's a very interesting story, just to give you an example of how much things have changed. Lesotho is a little country surrounded by South Africa, one of the poorest countries in Africa. There's an NPR story about the impact of Chinese business people in Lesotho. And the story started with an African businessman in Lesotho complaining, representing the Lesotho Chamber of Commerce, that unless the government did something to slow the move of Chinese business people into Lesotho, that all businesses in Lesotho would be run by Chinese in 5 years. This is one of the poorest countries in Africa. So what they're saying is that, yeah, there are problems, but as what Jim said and Raja said and I've said, when there are problems, when there's disruption, when there's chaos, there's opportunity. And they're taking advantage of weak governments, failed states, inefficient infrastructure to become market leaders at a time where Americans and Europeans are saying, it's not comfortable, it feels like Oklahoma, I don't want to go there. They say, Oklahoma's not a bad place to go. I mean, you know, there are people who choose to live in Oklahoma.
They just couldn't get out.
All right, let's go in the middle.
Yeah, Professor Doggett, I've thought about some of the things you said, and I couldn't agree more. I do see this phenomenon. I think about, the last 100 years that, the century for America, we essentially had the largest market, domestic market for ourselves, and a lot of successful companies and jobs and consequences. Yeah. So I'm looking at more of the long-term view, 20 years, 30, 50-year out view, most of them have children. Based on what you're saying, where is this country going to be with respect to the middle class, with respect to job creation, or I'm talking 20 to 30 years from now? And is there anything we can do about it, or is the innate ability to serve a billion-person market that China and India will have, is that gives them the best economy of scale that we simply can't?
We're going to tweet each other. That's her. In 30, 50 years, we're just going to tell everybody where we're eating dinner.
All right, so our question is, the question was 20 years, 30 years, 50 years out. We're all starting to work on our 100-year plans, I think, after our first session today. What does this look like in 20, 30, 50 years for our country, for our kids or our grandkids? I mean, what is the long-term outlook here?
Yeah, absolutely.
Raji?
Yeah, can I speak to that? I know you addressed this question. I know it sounds, somehow it was sounding a little dismal here, and in the interest of full disclosure, let me say a couple of things. I came to this country in '95. I did my PhD, and I've been in Texas for the last 9 years. And if you look at the history, and I didn't do American history in high school. I have kids in high school who do American history every year, so it's just from their homework. I think America has a power for recreation, or I'd like to think that. Or I think if you look at history, that seems to be the case. Look at 1929, right? If we had 1929, yes, the World War II inadvertently helped us because Europe was bombed out, and U.S. was involved not only in in saving Europe as we know it, but also in the reconstruction effort. Again, we had sort of a downtrend. So 50s was great, 60s, 70s, the oil crisis. Then we had, I think the technology in the late 90s came to the rescue, the internet. You could argue, we could have a discussion and debate as to whether the internet technology really created jobs or whether it was a myth. My own personal view is it did change things. Largest peacetime expansion in the 90s. So I actually do believe, and this is, I probably don't want to be quoted because people who forecast are usually wrong, but I hope there's some element of truth here, which is I think technology will see the way out of some of this. And let me sort of specify where I think what's going on here. I think there is a spirit of innovation in this country that perhaps cannot be matched. It's growing in China and India, and I completely agree with my colleagues here in terms of the threats that those countries pose. But I do think that there are areas where the technology can create new jobs. There's technology in terms of energy. There's clearly a crisis in this world. It's not a United States crisis. There's a crisis for the entire world. And I think technology will create new sectors. I want to share with you a quotation from the US Patent Office, and I think this was in the late 1800s, when the Commissioner of Patents said, everything that can be invented has been invented. Okay?
1899, December 31st.
Remember, yeah, we'll just take that to be the truth. I think his name is Duell. His name, this is attributed to him. If you do a search on the web, you'll find this quotation.
Yep.
Basically, what this says is that I think the human spirit in general, and I think the way we foster creativity in this country, there is the scope for new technologies. Who would have thought it possible about the internet? Who would have thought the things we do with the iPhone? So I actually do believe that, looking at the future by looking at what's happening in China, India, and what's happening in the United States in the last 4 to 5 to 7 years. And maybe I'm being optimistic. Maybe I'm just not realistic. I do think that there will be technologies, and these technologies might be in biotech. They may be in new energy, in solar cells. I mean, there may be a whole lot of things, and there has to be a channeling. And there's probably a disconnect in terms of when you make the investments and when you're going to get the returns. And I think that might sort of set the tone for the future. So,
well, and Raji, the other question, though, is back to your demographics issue, and that is National Instruments talked about reinvesting in education. If there's 1 billion people in India and I take the top 5% are going to be engineers and things, the top 5% of 300 million is smaller than 5% of 1 billion. So if we don't invest in the U.S. for a long time, it's falling behind in creating the engineering math skills. So that's why I think National Instruments has a program to reinvest in education just to maintain, because technology is what saved us up until this point, because manufacturing's been going overseas, all the other things. So it's got to be innovation.
yeah. I think it has to be innovation of some kind. We don't know what it is. And I think there are people who think about these things. There is a bigger issue that you raised, though, Jim, which is the issue of demography. And I think that it's a very sort of an interesting issue, which is, and there are people who are on both sides of the debate, which is basically the population of the United States has to increase to 600 million. I mean, there are people. What's that? Let's get busy. You want to do that? No, which is really sort of.
China pays not to have children. We're going to pay people to have children.
Yeah. No, and Russia's doing it. I think Putin said, go home and have kids. Let's get busy, right?
I thought he said go home and have sex.
Okay. So, but I think I'm going to sort of skip that one.
Sorry, I dismissed that.
No, I think the issue, there are complex issues.
Lost in translation, right?
There are complex issues, and it's not clear that there's one way to do this, but from sort of a commerce, economic perspective, it might be, the innovation may be the growth, if you look at the past.
Let me touch on that, since the question actually was directed toward me. I'm kidding.
Sorry for usurping it.
No, I love this. We're trying to have a little fun here. There's something that a lot of people forget. It was called the Cold War. We forget it because it ended abruptly. But the Cold War was a battle of visions, of philosophies, and of economies. And what we said was that our way was better. Who won the Cold War? We did. And in China, and in India, and in Africa, and in South America, the American way of life, as profligate and all the things that we are knocked for, is the role model. It is what people want. And so if it's what people want and we are the people who made it, the only issue is, can we figure out a way to be innovative enough that we can market it to people around the world who want our standard of living? I mean, if the French can sell Louis Vuitton bags, which have to be the ugliest things on the planet, for the amount of money they sell it for, just think what happens if we offer people stuff that actually looks good. Okay? So I'll give you an example. One of my consulting clients is in Austria, and when the iPhone came out, I was getting ready to go over to do some work with them, and the CEO called me and said, "John," I won't try to imitate his accent, but he said, "Could you buy me 5 iPhones? I've seen them, they're really cool, but I can't buy them in Austria." I said, "Well, you can get them on eBay." He said, "Yeah, we can get them on eBay, but the price on eBay is 999 euros. That's when the euro was $1.6 to the euro. And so I know you can buy it at the Apple store for less. I said, "Fine." I said, "But they're going to be AT&T." He said, "Don't worry, we already have crackers ready to crack them so we can use them." I said, "Fine." And so I go to the Apple store over in the Domain, and say I want to buy an iPhone. And I said, "Fine." They send me back to the desk. And this is a unique American phenomenon. They send me back to the Genius desk. That's what they have. The people who provide service are geniuses. They're certified geniuses by Apple, which is amazing, okay? I've never had a genius swipe my credit card before. And I said, I need to buy 5 iPhones. He said, fine, I need your ID and your credit card. I showed him, I gave them to him, and he just went to process it like it was an everyday event. And then I looked on the wall, behind him, there's a little sign saying, every customer is limited to 5 iPhones at a time. And what was happening was that this piece of technology was so cool that a whole bunch of people were making calls to their friends like me saying, could you bring me iPhones? Now, there's a great, bright analyst on Wall Street who looked at Apple's manufacturing and looked at how many iPhones had been activated on AT&T and said, Apple's pulling the wool over people's eyes because there's 1.5 million more iPhones that they've made than AT&T has activated. So they must be in warehouses someplace in Cupertino. Well, they were not. They were all over the world. So the next thing is I get ready to go back, and now the 3G iPhone has come out. And, my friend calls me again and says, John, I heard about the 3G. That's even cooler. Can you buy me a few? And I said, yeah, I could really do that. But I'm not going to. He said, why? Because you can buy it in Austria. Because with the first version of the iPhone, they only launched it in the U.S. The second version of the iPhone, they launched it in 27 countries, and one of those countries is Austria. So it doesn't make sense for me to buy it here. Pick one up in Austria. And so he did. And when I got to Austria, I said, well, how is it? He said, it's really cool. And by the way, the cell phone carrier in Austria that has the exclusive contract for the iPhone 3G has a promotion going on. I said, well, cool. What's the promotion? If you sign up for a 2-year contract, they'll give you an iPhone for €1. I said, well, maybe I should buy some here and bring it back to the United States. But what was interesting was that because they had this promotion with an American piece of technology that's manufactured in Taiwan and in China, but it's American software and technology, their market share increase was massive. And the #1 cell phone company was seeing people defect because they wanted the iPhone. And so we have one choice, and what Roger said and Jim said is absolutely true. We're going to have to innovate our you-know-what's off. But the good news is the world wants what we have, and if we can figure out how to make it and package it and continue to keep it fresh, we should be competitive. Will we be the largest economy in the world? No. How could a country of 308 million have an economy larger than 2 countries with more than 1 billion people, everything else being equal? And the answer is that's not sustainable. Do we have to be the largest economy? The answer is no. I was in Switzerland back in the 90s, where a little country of 7 million people had 1/3 of all the world's banking assets. 1/3. And they weren't worried about not being the largest economy, even in Europe. They said, well, just take 1/3 of the assets of the world, banking assets of the world.
So we've gotten through 2 questions already. It's kind of like barbershop quartets. It's not hard to get them to start. It's hard to get them to stop. And I think faculty are kind of the same way. Are there questions over here that I'm not sure? Go ahead, sir. So the question is, should the government step in? Should the government be involved? Okay. Okay. So should the government take a more active role in trying to regulate our activity, whether it's international or even domestic, I guess, as well, is a kind of extension of that question.
I'm a free market guy. I'm not the guy to ask that question. I'm free markets, and the government just interferes in those markets, so I'm the wrong person to ask that question. I mean, I'm concerned about the loss of our manufacturing base, just from a strategic standpoint, and the government should be worried as well. I mean, it's going to be hard to fight wars if you can't build tanks and planes, and so there's strategic things that they may have to do in order to maintain that core competency. But in general, I always struggle to find any government operation that I would consider to be efficient in the use of anything, capital or anything. So government dictating, I mean, we're already moving to a lot of government controls in a lot of industries, getting them more and saying we have to be in certain industries and things. I'm probably not in favor of that overall.
I always love those of us who work for the state government of Texas who share, because I am from the same perspective of Jim, although we both are government employees. So there's some of us.
I didn't say this was the most efficient operation.
I mean, amen. I mean, how much did we just give away in free food, drinks, and everything else? What's interesting is there's an old joke in the business. If it's on the cover of Time or Business Week, it's old news. And what's going on is that both in China and in India, the governments are actually trying to become less involved. If you look at, especially the migration into Latin America and to Africa, a lot of it's personal. People just, they want more space, they want more opportunity, they just get on planes and going. And clearly there is some government involvement, there's no question about it. But what's happening is that when I've been taking students to China for a number of years, and in one of our hotels, there was an office for returnees, Chinese who had been working overseas and who were coming back. The Chinese government is encouraging Chinese who worked in other countries to come back to China and bring their institutional knowledge of what it takes to work in other countries. Well, guess what? They're very successful, and they're coming back. But they're not just coming back with business knowledge, they're also coming back with a greater sense of personal and political freedom, and they're saying, we want it to be more free there. So the Chinese government is actually less involved in the economy now than any time. Do they have some goals? Absolutely. But we have goals. I mean, think about it. Think about our reinvestment plan, or whatever they call it. And we're spending, what, $1.9 trillion? If that's not government policy, and your question is, should we have more of that? My answer is no.
All right. Got a $50 trillion U.S. note.
We can take a couple more questions here. Sure. Sorry, I didn't hear the question. Are there still isolationists?
Yeah, are there any isolations in this country, and if there are, is it affecting foreign investment?
Okay.
Well, yeah, there's still some people that are isolationists, but I think for the most part, the globalization of the world has happened. There's no turning back. I mean, I think there's still people believe that, capital and labor is going to move to the market that produces it the most efficient and the cheapest. And if you read The World is Flat, I mean, that's what's happening. I just don't see that ever going back to this isolationist policy, because I think we're all joined at the hips and interconnected now. It's going to be very difficult to go back to isolationist policies.
There's a level of ignorance still about what's going on outside the United States that results in fear and confusion about what we call outsourcing or jobs going away. And so let's talk about the cell phone industry. A lot of people say, well, Motorola or Apple should not make stuff out offshore. They should not take manufacturing jobs offshore. So let's look at a little country called India. In January, 10 million people signed up new for the first time for cell phone in the month of January. When you look at India and China, you're looking at an average of somewhere between 15 to 25 million new cell phone subscribers every month. Every month. In 1997, India and China combined had 15.3 million cell phone subscribers, in the two countries combined. 10 years later, the number was 650 million. And by 2013, the number will be over 1 billion cell phone subscribers. And what makes that significant is in the United States and some other countries, we're almost at 100% penetration for cell phones, because a lot of us have more than one. At 1 billion cell phone subscribers in India and China, there will still be 1.5 billion people who don't have cell phones in India and China. And so if you're going to be in the cell phone business and you're not in India and China, you're not in business. There's still a lot of people, and some of them are in Congress, who don't understand that. And they talk about you're shipping jobs overseas. Well, it's really very simple. If you're going to make cell phones and sell them, if you're going to make computers and sell them, If you're going to make cars and sell them, you got to go where the most dynamic market is, and the most dynamic market for those three products is the People's Republic of China. It's not a question whether we like it or not. It's just you got all these millions of people becoming members of the middle class for the first time and wanting to buy cell phones, PCs, and cars.
All right, so I think as a final question, I'll kind of repeat the question that we had at the end of the last panel, which is what do we do with this information? So if there's a takeaway or two, what would you give us from your perspective in terms of, given that our panel was ostensibly about growth, and maybe not globalization, but you know, kind of went that way, which is fine. What would be one or two of your takeaways for us today, each of you, around growth?
I would sort of say the first thing is to be optimistic. I think a lot of what we do, both at the individual and at the firm level, becomes self-fulfilling prophecies. And what do I mean when I say that? If we do think that there's no way out of this, you know, situation that we are in our company or for our industrial sector, then we'll pull back investments. We are going to be, so that it will just go down that path. So the first thing I would say is sort of, you know, optimism, I think would be the second, I think, is, you know, actually I was on a flight today from Boston and I was reading a New Yorker magazine where it's talking about skill sets, individual skill sets. And one of the, you know, there's an interesting article, and this is talking about, I don't know, you probably read this book, I read this in the 70s or 80s, The Art of Bicycle Maintenance, Zen and the Art of Bicycle Maintenance by Persig, right? And how employees, he was making the case, there's a new book out, I forget the name of that book, the new book, which basically says employees today in US corporations, we have lost pride in what we do because we are no longer artisans. We don't have skills. And so one of the points that this individual was making, this is a book review, was that if we develop skill sets that cannot be shipped overseas, and I'm going to take a slightly different viewpoint from John here, which is, you know, maybe we don't have to worry about skills being shipped out, but I actually do worry. And for me, being an Indian origin person, and now I have an American citizenship, the only good thing about outsourcing is it's going to India, which is my country of origin, okay? Because I think, you know, if the US market has really ridden on the backs of consumers, right? And in order to consume, we need money. And in order to have money, we must have employment. So I think the whole issue is, maybe one of the things as you sort of leave today is think about your skill sets, your personal skill sets that are more artisan rather than sort of shippable. You know, I mean, is there something that we can do in terms, and so he was basically saying the plumber, and I'm going to give you jobs that don't really sort of apply to us, but think about skill sets which make us unique in some ways that cannot necessarily be shipped over. And so that might be something to invest in as you sort of move forward individually, I think.
And I'd agree. I mean, I think that's what's ironic is that they were going to make this huge federal investment in infrastructure and give all these contracts to build roads and schools. And they can't, I deal with contractors all the time in my consulting practice, and they'll say you can't find a plumber or an electrician or a carpenter, those skill sets, because we told our elementary school, our public school system that they ought to all go to college, and we quit teaching vocational arts. And so we got a bunch of unemployed Macy's workers that are supposed to build bridges now. And that just is a mismatch of skill, talent. So my takeaway from all of this is that Kim DeAngelis at Austin Ventures told me he thinks there's going to be half as many venture capital firms 2 years from now than there are today. There's roughly 900 venture firms right now. Most of them will not receive more funding from the limited partners, the endowments and things, because the asset class as a whole has had terrible performance. So that's going to influence innovation and problems like that. So you're finding all these entrepreneurs are bootstrapping now. The problem with bootstrapping is that we're going to end up with an economy where everybody's making an iPhone application, okay, and selling it for $1.99. I mean, I don't know you can run that economy that way. So I agree with Roddy. I think it's skill sets that can be employed here. We have to have that innovation advantage that we've built up and maintain that, and that goes back to education and having people with the right skill sets.
I'm incredibly optimistic about our prospects. There's a colleague of ours who used to teach here, Leslie Young, who's now at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and he made a prediction about 6 years ago that I think is absolutely spot on. He said, if you think about what's going on in China and India, use those as two examples, as their economies grow, what are they doing? They're continuing to industrialize. Well, what's the precondition from industrialization? You got to improve your electric grid, and you have to build factories. Well, where do you build factories? You build factories on land, and what was that land being used before for? It was being used for farming, because you're taking agrarian societies and making them more industrial societies. Well, two things are going on. You're taking farmland out of production, and you're increasing the middle class, and people are having more buying power, and they're wanting different things to eat, and one of those things are food. And so he predicts that by the middle of the next decade, both the European Union and America will no longer need to have farm subsidies, because we'll be able to sell as much as we can grow to China and to India and to Brazil and other parts of the world that are industrializing. And to understand what that will do, in Europe, 40% of the European Union's budget is for their common agricultural policy. That's what they call it. It's farm subsidies. Every cow in Great Britain gets paid €2.50 a day for being a cow. As a subsidies. And I once had a Spanish student in my class whose father was a farmer, and he asked the class, what do you think my father has to do to make more money as a farmer in Spain? And everybody said, well, grow more. And they said, no, threaten to grow more. And he'll get more money, subsidies not to grow more. Well, that's going to end. So that's the first thing. There's a company I know up in Holland, Michigan, which is a little small town, very high-end town on the shores of Lake Michigan, where they, for many years, are making high-end fiberglass boats. When I say high-end, these are boats from 35 to about 55 feet, not cheap boats. And they're some of the best manufacturers of high-end fiberglass boats. This is not an economy to be a high-end fiberglass boat manufacturer right now. And so the CEO called me because I'd given a speech up there, and we talked about strategy, and we ended up with him saying, we've decided that we have a skill set that makes us he said that we've been rated as probably in the top 3% of fabricators of fiberglass. And we've been doing some research looking at alternative energy, and one of the things we've seen is that there are more and more of these wind towers being put up, and one of the problems is that the blades are breaking, because the people who are making the blades don't have the same skill set in fiberglass as we do. And so I have made a commitment to take part of my team, that doesn't do anything anyway because nobody's buying boats, to become experts in the manufacturing of large fiberglass blades. And so, he and I were talking about places he could go to get started in that business. So that's the second thing. And the third one, I had to put a note to myself. The third thing I recommend to you, and I guess the last thing is, if you have not traveled outside of Oklahoma, if you have not been to China, if you have not been to India, when you take vacations, you go to New York City or Western Europe, get on an airplane and go there and go see what's going on. And I guarantee when you come back, you'll have so many ideas of businesses that you can do. And as an example, one of my former students used to work for Dell. And on the side, he's Chinese, on the side he identified building materials that he thought that he could import from China. And so he started importing building materials from China as a part-time job. And I said, well, what's your strategy? He said, my strategy is when my income from importing building materials equals what I'm making at Dell, including bonus, I'm quitting. Well, he quit a few years ago. Well, guess what? Ships go both ways. And those ships that come here with all those imports need to be going back with exports. But they can't go back with exports if you've never been to the place where exports have to go to. And so one of the biggest challenges I see with Americans is we don't travel. We don't know what's going on. And for those of us who travel, we get off the plane, we start walking around, and if you're a business person, you immediately say, hey, here, I can make money doing this, I can make money doing that. That's my advice. Just get on the plane, go someplace other than the United States and Western Europe, and come back and make money.
All right. Well, I have a very fun job. My job is to try and essentially export faculty. I get to work with brilliant folks and connect them to industry. That's my job. And in executive education, we are happy to connect our faculty to your organization, to bring your people in, to hear folks like this. And really, we heard a lot today about people and about investing in your people, and that's what we do in exec ed, is provide people a mechanism to do that. And so if you have any questions for us, if you have folks that you want to try and connect, please don't hesitate to talk to me or to Chantal or any of our staff. I hope that you enjoyed your luxury of opportunity today, that you got a chance to kind of sit back and think and hear some interesting ideas both from industry and from our faculty. I'd like to thank our faculty panelists in this session.